Good evening, everyone, from the British Museum in London. I'm Jane Portal, and I'm the Keeper of Asia at the British Museum. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this talk on the exhibition Burma to Myanmar, the first exhibition dedicated to Myanmar's complex histories. And here to speak to you today are Alexandra Green and Sandra Dudley. And Alexandra is the Henry Ginsberg Curator for Southeast Asia at the British Museum, and she's curator of the Burma to Myanmar exhibition. And in addition to the exhibition book, she has also recently published Southeast Asia, History and Objects, based on the British Museum's collection. And Sandra is a social anthropologist at the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester, and she specialises in museums, art and material culture, forced migration, conflict and exile, and has worked extensively with the Karen people of Myanmar and Thailand. So, over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm Alexandra Green, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about the exhibition Burma to Myanmar at the British Museum. It's a landmark in exploring the long histories of the country, and we are doing it through the lens of cross-cultural interactions, looking at the importance of these exchanges on material culture and art. Despite Myanmar's colonial importance, while it was controlled by the British, the country is actually relatively unknown in Britain today. But 2023 is the 75th anniversary of Myanmar's independence from Britain. So it was a fantastic opportunity to bring Myanmar to the fore in the UK via the exhibition and globally via the book that accompanies the exhibition. One of the things that's particularly interesting about this show is that even before the coup, before the cost of living crisis, I had planned to borrow mostly from UK collections because Myanmar was so important to Britain when it was a colony. And there's just things from Myanmar all over the UK. So it was a fantastic opportunity to look around and see what is held in museums and private collections here. So the region is actually historically diverse. Its formation as a single entity, it only happened in 1948. Prior to that, it was home to many different political bodies, from kingdoms to empires to principalities, chiefdoms, and kinship networks. And until independence, it was not a single entity. So the exhibition really has been an exercise in how to display multiplicity and diversity without promoting a majority view. So this diversity is, of course, promoted in part by the country's geography and its fabulous wealth. It has amazing natural resources, as you can see here, and it has been a very wealthy entity. I think one of the things that we tend to think of with developing countries is that they're poor. Myanmar is not at all poor. Its resources are just poorly distributed. It is an amazingly wealthy country. And this letter fantastically exemplifies both the wealth of the country. It exemplifies the Burmese empire back in the 18th century. And it also shows connections with Britain. This is a gold letter written by King Alangpaya of Myanmar to King George II of Great Britain in 1756. The letter is written on gold. It's set with 24 Burmese rubies, and it was rolled up and sent in an ivory tusk container. In it, the King Alangpaya has just founded the Kombang dynasty in 1752. His dynasty was rapidly expanding. It expanded, the empire expanded to one of the greatest extents in mainland Southeast Asia, and it gives you a sense of how wealthy the kingdom was, its power, but also the fact that King Alangpaya is trying to establish himself diplomatically. So it was a diplomatic overture to King George. Basically, the King Alangpaya introduces himself, and George unfortunately didn't understand it for what it was, and he merely sent it to his personal library in Hanover. So this is one of only 2 objects in the exhibition that actually come from outside of the UK. So anyway, it gives us a real sense of the strength, power, and wealth of Myanmar in the 18th century. But there are many other resources that the country has. I mean, it's known for its gems, but of course it has gold, silver. It has all sorts of different types of resources, and we discuss those at the outset to really give people a sense of the wealth of the kingdom. One of the things that it also it possesses is huge bodies of teak, and teak here is an amazing steering chair from a boat. It's carved in incredibly high relief, like you would get in, the standard part of central Myanmar's output. But then it's also carved with peacocks, which are an emblem of the Kombang dynasty established by King Alangpea. But you can also see in the front right corner a lion that looks very British. And in the center, you have a figure that has angel wings. So clearly, even though they're producing something for a local market, the artists are already incorporating ideas from the world around them. And that's what this show is really about. So all the objects show us some form of cross-cultural interaction. And so not only does this include European motifs, but it was collected by Lord Curzon, who was Viceroy of India. And of course, during colonial times, until 1937, Burma was simply part of British India. So the country's very wealthy. It's been a major empire. King Alangpea considers himself an equal to George. But then how do you deal with the fact that the country actually wasn't a single entity? And how do you then do this without, focusing on that majority population, which is what many exhibitions tend to do? So the way we dealt with it was by pulling the country apart into its historical sections. So you've got kingdoms in Arakan on the west coast. You've got the central Myanmar kingdom, which expanded into these empires. You have kingdoms in lower Myanmar, you have kingdoms in what is today Eastern Myanmar, and then in the mountainous regions around the shape of the country, around the edges of the country, you have all these different highland communities, which were complex politically, but were not state-based. So that's how we deal with that. So we're going to then look at each of these different sections, and that's how we do it in the exhibition and in the book as well. So first, kingdoms in Arakan. There's evidence of kingdoms from nearly 2,000 years ago, and the kingdoms were very powerful. They were wealthy in their own right, and because it was coastal, the focus was on trade. And this is an amazing coin issued by King Dharmaraja Hussain in Bengali, in Persian, written in Arabic script and in Arakanese. So the side that you see on the left is in Arakanese, and on the reverse you see the Bengali and the Persian. King Dharmaraja Hussain had wide trade. Early 1600s, it was an incredibly powerful empire in its own right, and the king was issuing coinage in 3 languages as a way to be able to deal with all these different communities that were coming to trade with Arakan. It also shows kind of the extent of his networks as far as away as Persia, and of course with Bengal, they controlled part of what is today Bengal and Bangladesh. So so you have a kind of a smaller empire in what is today Rakhine state. Also, there were many, many Muslims in the area, and you can see this by the fact that the king has combined Dharmaraja, which is a Buddhist title, with Hussein, which is a Muslim name. So clearly, the communities in ancient Arakan were diverse. And then, just as another, so I'm going to show you sort of a snippet from each of the different sections. So this is a storage jar that was produced in the kingdom of Bago in lower Myanmar. This was another trading nation because it was on the coast. And of course, Myanmar was phenomenally well connected. You saw it was linked with inland trade routes up into the Shan states and up into southwestern China, and of course by sea over the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean and as far as Europe. Storage jars like these were produced in the region for use on ships for food, water, and of course, goods that were being traded. Shan states in what is today Eastern Myanmar. This is a fabulous map from the 1880s that was produced as the British and Chinese were trying to determine a hard border. Borders are not something that was important in Southeast Asia before colonial times. And it was more about people, control of people, and spheres of influence. This map shows 3 different Shan states. The yellow is Maung Mao, the red is Nam Kam, and the black is Ceylon. Ceylon is a tributary of Nam Kam. And they, they exchanged, they worked with each other diplomatically, they fought with each other, and these kingdoms waxed and waned as all kingdoms do. When the hard borders were instituted, then suddenly the yellow, Maung Mao, was part of China, and the red and the black remained part of Myanmar. So ethnically linked kingdoms were now suddenly separated. And then we also look at the highland regions. This is an image of a Kachin chief, Ngalangla. One of the things that we have done is we have because it's not possible to represent all of the people in Myanmar. It's one of the world's most diverse areas with more than 130 different groups. So we focused on a few that can be seen, well, I should say their material culture is represented very well in UK collections. And this photograph of the Kachin chief, you see him wearing a Chinese robe, a Burmese skirt cloth. He's wearing a Chinese turban and a Kachin turban, and he's smoking a pipe that's associated with the Shan states, but can be found around the region. And he is not cobbling things together. He is expressing the extent of his diplomatic abilities. Basically, one way to show your authority in the highland areas was to be able to negotiate across many different cultures. So he is here showing the extent of his diplomatic connections with China, with the Shan states, with the Burmese court. So a very powerful person. And then, of course, central Myanmar. So central Myanmar, because that is the majority Burman Buddhist community, it was very easy to then find all sorts of things connected with them in the UK. So I decided to focus on 2 major events. One is the 1750s march into what is today Manipur in Northeast India, and the removal of people there back to central Myanmar, which was a standard feature of Southeast Asian warfare. And then also the 1767 march east into what is today central Thailand and sack the kingdom of Ayutthaya and bring people back. So in Southeast Asia, it wasn't a matter of bringing people back and then just simply using them as slave labor. It's very much, if you were kind of a silversmith in one place, well, they wanted your skills to be put to the use of the king in another place. So they would relocate you and you'd be a silversmith somewhere else. So this tapestry is a result of the capture of Thai theatrical troops from the court. They were brought back to central Myanmar, and they took the Burmese court by storm. The court absolutely loved them and adapted its court dress to reflect the Thai theatrical costumes. The Thai troops performed a story called the Ramayana, which is an ancient Indian epic that Southeast Asian kingdoms adapted for local use. And although the Ramayana was known before 1767 in central Myanmar, it became particularly popular as the Thai theatrical troops became popular. And then it was replicated in various art forms in the theater, but then also on tapestries, which would have been hung up in the eaves of buildings. It would have been hung as a surround to a king or in a temple. And it shows scenes of the Ramayana. So you see Prince Rama, who was banished to a forest, and he and his wife was kidnapped while they were in the forest by the demon Ravana. And it's his decade-long search for his wife, aided by the white monkey Hanuman, whom you can see in the upper right, flying through the air. And at the end of the decade, of course, they are able to rescue Princess Sita. Then we turn to, having looked at the different sections of the kingdom, again through this lens of cross-cultural interaction, we turn to the colonial period. This is a very large Buddha image that was acquired by a Captain Marryat in the First Anglo-Burmese War of 1824 to 26. The kingdom was taken over, or I should say the various parts of the kingdom were taken over in 3 stages. So in 1824 to 26, basically Arakan, which had been captured by the Burmese 40 years before, the Central Burmese 40 years before, was then taken, and the tail of the country was taken. After the Second Anglo-Burmese War of 1852, the rest of Lower Myanmar was taken, and then in the 1880s, the remainder of the kingdom was acquired. This was ruled in a parliamentary fashion, and then the highland regions were controlled indirectly through local leaders. But anyway, the First Anglo-Burmese War, and actually in 1885 as well, both the first and the last war were accompanied by substantial looting, and this piece was acquired during that time. Stylistically, it was produced around the early, basically the 1820s, so it probably was new or had just recently been made when Captain Marryat took it. So this time, there are, again, so many things one can say about the colonial period, so we don't focus on life, daily life or things like that, but we look at, again, the material impacts that colonial rule had on material culture and art. So, for example, there's an amazing ivory chair that is in the Liverpool Museum, but it's a typical European shape, but it's carved in very high relief in typical Burmese fashion, and again with Burmese floral and animal motifs. It's an amazing piece. And we also look at the arrival of new communities. So Myanmar, or should I say British Burma, became very international, very cosmopolitan, to the point where Rangoon, now Yangon, the capital city, by the 1930s was only 30% Burmese. Everybody else was from somewhere else. So there was a huge rise in Indian communities and Chinese communities, and of course in European communities. And this is a lacquer plate produced in a typically Burmese fashion, a black lacquer with gold leaf decoration, but obviously made for a member of the Indian community, because it shows Gandhi, who visited British Burma 3 times during his efforts to obviously help India become independent. The imposition of the census had a radical impact on the way ethnicity was viewed, and we still see the ramifications of that today. So prior to the colonial times, ethnicity was something that was quite flexible. You changed the way you behaved, what you wore, almost what you ate, based on the context in which you were in. Whether you were home with your family, whether you were with your patron, who might be a different ethnic group, you changed and adapted, and it wasn't a way of dividing society. With the imposition of the census, everybody had to say they were Karen or Kachin or Chin or Burman. There couldn't be any ambiguity. And so this led to the rigidification of ethnic boundaries that, as I said, still have issues today. But you can see that reflected, these rigidifications reflected in these figures that were commonly produced during this time. Everybody had to wear something specific. The Karen people wore something specific. The Kachin people wore something specific, and there was no variation. So this continues to cause problems. The colonial period effectively ended with World War II as the British were pushed out by the Japanese, and it was particularly savage fighting in Myanmar, and people who fought in the Burma arena were awarded the Burma Star. A group of fighters who were particularly important during World War II in the fight to regain Burma from the Japanese were the Gurkhas, who were soldiers from Nepal who had been incorporated into the British Army since 1816. And they were particularly important in that push to regain Burma between 1944 and 1945. We also look at General Aung San, who supported initially the Japanese as a way to push the British out of Burma, but as Japanese colonial intentions became clear, he negotiated with the Allies and switched sides and helped push the Japanese out. But his condition for doing this was that immediately after the war, negotiations were to begin to make Burma independent, which it did. It became independent in January 1948. Unfortunately, General Aung San was assassinated in July 1947, so he didn't live to see it. We also have a small section looking at what happened after independence. There was a short period of democratic rule, and then General Ne Win took over, setting the country on the Burmese path to socialism. So again, because this time is so close to, contemporary times, it's very easy to talk about many, many different things. But instead, we've focused on a few well-known people. So General Ne Win, the first Prime Minister of Myanmar, U Nu, Daw San Suu Kyi, of course. And then we look at the conditions that people experienced under the regime, the military junta. And then we also continue by looking at ethnic relationships. So we look at the Rohingya genocide. We look at the opportunities offered to artists to travel abroad and express their ethnicities during the period of 2010 to basically 2021. And we also look at how various ethnic groups are pushing back against the military junta's homogenization. This is an amazing painting by a man named San Min, and it was painted in the 1980s, and it gives you a real sense of the strife that the country has encountered. So it's a typical car that would have been available only to those with military connections. The red obviously refers to rebellion and bloodshed, and of course the tank tread tires indicate the conditions under which people were ruled. And of course, it was this this military rule that has caused people to flee and leave their homes and become refugees. The Rohingya, but also, as I'm sure Sandra will mention, many people living in camps in northern Thailand who fled from the eastern side of the country. So I'm going to stop there. That's a very basic survey of the exhibition. I do hope you'll come and see it. You can also look at the book, which is Burma to Myanmar, and if you're interested in Southeast Asian objects, you can look at the Southeast Asia History and Objects book, all of which have a great deal more detail. But this is sort of a potted introduction to the exhibition, and I'm going to hand over to Sandra, who's going to talk about the Kren and textiles in much more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, and enormous thanks to you and to the British Museum for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm really thrilled to be able to join you, and delighted that so many of you are able to join us online. Thank you for your time in doing that. So for many years, my research has focused on Myanmar. I'm a social and material anthropologist, and I'm especially interested in the roles that materials and things play in people's lives. And I hope just in the short space of time I have this evening that I can give you a brief glimpse into what I might mean by that in the context of Myanmar and the British Museum's wonderful new exhibition. One example of artifacts and the roles that they play in life is this textile from the British Museum's collections. It doesn't actually appear in the exhibition, but you will find it discussed in the accompanying book that Alexandra has already mentioned. This is a woman's skirt cloth, and we can tell from the central hand-stitched seam, and you can see that seam in more detail here, particularly in the detail shot on the right, we can tell from that seam that the cloth was made on a backstrap loom. Backstrap looms, and here is an image of a refugee, and I'll talk a bit more about this particular refugee community in a minute, but here's an image of a refugee using a Karen-style backstrap loom in the late 1990s. This is a production technique for textiles that can only produce narrow lengths of cloth. So if one is using this technique to produce a skirt cloth, you need two widths, which are then hand stitched together, as you saw in the detail. Another thing that's very characteristic about this particular skirt cloth in the British Museum collections is that it's a classic or a typical cloth of the Sagaur Karen people of Myanmar. So how do we know that? Well, the main giveaways are the cloth's characteristic combination of colours, in which red predominates, together with the use of a warp ikat dyeing technique that produces the distinctive so-called python skin patterning that you can see in the central band of the cloth. This kind of link between dress and an ethnically defined identity is, of course, not unique to the Karen, and in Myanmar, it is actually an especially significant phenomenon more broadly. And there are some links to what I'm going to say about this now, to some of the comments that Alexandra has already made about ethnic identities and the formalization and change in those with the coming of the colonial period and the census. So many of Myanmar's, or pretty much all of Myanmar's many different groups, have their own customary forms of clothing that are produced with particular and distinctive sets of fibres, techniques and colours. Interestingly, while these forms have long been produced, the associations between the textiles and dress on the one hand and ethnically defined identities on the other did become much more essentialised with the coming of European colonialism. This was especially so in the case of Myanmar's myriad minoritised groups, many of whom still live, in the country's more mountainous regions. For colonial administrators and missionaries during the colonial period, as they tried to make sense of and categorise all the different peoples that they encountered, they drew increasingly correlative lines between groups and their customary clothing. This reached the extent that really minor variations in style, design, colour were all treated as definitive, even diagnostic, of different ethnicities. This reached such a degree in Myanmar that as early as 1911, it was already being criticised as overdone. So J.G. Scott, who was a well-known colonial officer and scholar of Burma, bemoaned what he called the overclassification that had led to descriptions of the country's ethnic groups reading like a table of fashion plates or a history of tartans. Nonetheless, the significance attributed to different groups' styles of clothing has continued to the present day. For example, each self-identifying group now not only claims its own form of traditional dress, but also expects to be represented by it in Myanmar's museums, either on dressed mannequins, such as you see on this slide, or via miniature figurines similar to those in the Burma to Myanmar exhibition, which Alexandra has talked about. But while so-called traditional textiles and their correlation with ethnically defined identities might be essentialized, the kinds of textiles that people actually call traditional are not necessarily fixed in the form that they take, despite the connotations of the word traditional. So one instance of this that I'd like to briefly tell you about is the deliberate creation of a new kind of skirt cloth with the intention that it becomes the established traditional form. My example of this comes from a refugee community I've worked with since the 1990s. Most of this community comes from Kayah State in eastern Myanmar, and the arrow on the slide is pointing to Kayah State. It's on the border of northwestern Thailand. But I should note that the refugee community I worked with in camps on the border in northwestern Thailand prefer to call Kayah State by its older name, Karenni State. Amongst that refugee community, there are up to 12 self-distinguishing, ethnically defined groups, all of which group under the umbrella label Karenni. Each of these groups has its own mother tongue and its own distinctive forms of so-called clothing. But in addition, after 1948, members of the growing Karenni nationalist movement developed a style of dress that's now formally considered the national dress for all the different ethnically defined groups who live in Kayah State. So as we can see on this slide, for women, this dress consists of a skirt cloth that is patterned with warp stripes and a similar cloak. The colour and patterning of these cloths are related to the head and skirt cloths that are customarily worn by women from the Kayah ethnic group, which is just one of those 12 or so groups that group under the Karenni umbrella. So here you can see the similarity in colour and warp striping between the Kayah women's headcloth on the left and the Karenni national cloak on the right. And in this other comparison, you can see similar correlations between the Kayah skirt cloth that you can see worn by the seated woman on the left and the skirt cloths in the national dress shown on the right. There are three big differences between these forms of dress, however. National Karenni dress on the right is considered the national dress for all the ethnic groups from Kayah State, whereas the style of dress on the left is specific to the Kayah ethnic group. The second difference is that the national dress is more concealing of the female body and linked to ideas of propriety. There's a really interesting kind of set of issues and stories around that particular theme that I don't have time to go into now, but it's important. Third, the Kayah women's cloths on the left are produced on backstrap looms using homespun cotton that is coloured with natural materials. On the other hand, the national Karenni cloths on the right are produced in one piece on frame looms using commercially spun yarn coloured with synthetic dyes. More broadly in Myanmar, these kinds of differences in production technique, and particularly in the kinds of dyes used to produce red and other colours, have been the focus of some really groundbreaking research that's been done on some of the textiles in the Burma to Myanmar exhibition. And that research has been done by the curator, Alexandra, together with Diego Tamburini, Caroline Cartwright, and Joanne Dyer. So an example of some of the work that they've done, can be seen in this Paku Karen headcloth. This headcloth appears in the exhibition. The main body of the fabric of the cloth consists of a warp-faced, undyed cotton cloth, while the geometric decorations at the ends have been produced using continuous and discontinuous supplementary weft techniques and coloured wool. What's really interesting is that the British Museum's scientific analysis has revealed that all of the wool hues result from synthetic dyes produced in Europe. So we now know, for example, that the two pinks, and they're kind of coral pink highlighted in the arrows on this slide, these two pinks evident in the cloth were produced using mixtures of rhodamine B, which is a synthetic pink red dye, and auramine O, which is a synthetic yellow dye. What's more, existing knowledge about the years in which each of these synthetic dyes were first made tells us that the earliest this textile could have been produced was sometime after 1887, which is when rhodamine B, the youngest dye formula present in this textile, was first synthesized. It wasn't only dyes, however, that began to be imported from Europe in the latter part of the 19th century. Materials were also coming into Myanmar, and we can find a wonderful example of this in this really beautiful Karen women's shirt, which also appears in the exhibition. So if we look at some detail of this shirt, we can see that it's decorated with two different kinds of lacquer or Job's tears seeds, and with linear and geometric designs that are embroidered onto the cloth using chain stitch and asymmetric cross stitch. The seeds originate locally in mainland Southeast Asia, and the main cloth that the shirt is made of is also locally dyed, indigo dyed cotton. Other local natural dyes are also used in the colouring of the threads used for the embroidery. However, with the help of the British Museum's research, we now know even more, and it can lead us to suppose that the red appliqued strips of fabric on the shirt were exported as fabric from Europe to Myanmar. We can conclude this for two reasons. First, the strips are made of felted wool, and that's not a common material for the Karen to use. And second, although the felt was dyed red using a combination of three natural dyes, and those happen to be lac, cochineal, and fustic, tin was used as a mordant in the dyeing process. Tin was especially good for brightening red dyes, and at the time, it was a common mordant used in Europe. This is really fascinating because, like the use of the synthetic dyes in the headcloth that we saw, it's information that helps to demonstrate the extent to which supposedly remote minoritized communities and their making practices were in reality linked into a wide array of trade networks, including in the second colonial half of Myanmar's 19th century, an inwards flow of European fabrics and dyes. There's an enormous scope for further research here. So, for example, we could look into the global trade trajectories of commercially dyed yarns and the relationship of that trade to increasing colonial control. And this kind of work is really at its beginning and is very exciting. But this evening, I'd like to end by emphasizing something that's really dear to my heart, and that's how precisely the physicality of museum objects is critical to understanding the things that we see in the Burma to Myanmar exhibition, and for that matter, the things that we see in museums more generally. Museums' needs to protect their collections mean, of course, that we as museum visitors can rarely properly interact with those physical objects on display. So we can't wear them, we can't touch them, and so on. But that shouldn't cause us to forget the physical, sensory, and emotional relationships between people and things in everyday life, in the past and in the present. So, for example, what might have been the impacts of inflowing synthetically dyed brighter colours on the shifting tastes and practices in textile production by the Karen people and others in Myanmar? Why were these more vivid shades of thread adopted? For example, was it because of aggressive marketing strategies? Was it because it was easier than locally producing colours from scratch using natural dyes? Was it because novelty and experimentation were welcomed? Was it because the brightness of synthetic dyes was more appealing? Was it because those dyes and materials just happened to be readily available via gifts and surplus from local missionaries and others? Or was it for some other reason? We don't yet know the answer to these kinds of questions, although it's interesting to note that the argument that was given to me over a century later by late 20th century Karenni weavers was that they simply preferred the clarity of synthetic shades to the more muted effects of natural dyes. But whatever the detailed explanations, these objects and their stories are about much more than economics, politics, or convenience. Matters of colour and fibre, for example, are also about taste and choosing what to wear, how to look, and how to feel in day-to-day life. I think they're a salutary reminder to all of us not to pigeonhole textiles or other artefacts as simply traditional and static in form. The textiles and other items that we see in the Burma to Myanmar exhibition and in the book reveal a really fascinating set of changes over time. And in the case of the clothing items, they were made to be worn. As such, they tell us something about and potentially enable us as museum visitors to connect with real people, not just historical periods. Yes, they tell us interesting stories about and through things that were made and used before today, as well as about how things have come to be the way they are now. But they're also examples of physical, sensory, and emotionally loaded ways in which people have engaged with them. Skirt cloths, for example, are simultaneously representational of identities and social histories and manifestations of real life lived through human bodies. If we listen carefully, I think these things can tell us something about how the people who made and used them experienced their lives. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm now going to hand back to Jane.
Thanks, Sandra. Well, we have some questions here, and I do encourage anybody else listening to send in questions. Our first question is from Isabel Robbins. Actually, it's several questions, really. She says, you mentioned, I think this is probably for Alexandra, you mentioned that the collection shown is based on what is available in the UK. Did anyone from Myanmar review or comment on the exhibition? Was there any collaboration with Myanmar? And then, did you borrow anything from Myanmar?
Thank you for the question. The answer to that is a bit long-winded. We had hoped to work with communities in Myanmar, and I went out in February 2020, right before lockdown, and talked to various museums. I met with the the Ministry of Culture, the Department of Archaeology, but then of course with the coup, collaboration with museums there became impossible. However, we have collaborated. There's a big Burmese community from many different ethnic groups here in the UK, and we have worked with them. I've had a Burmese intern who actually continues to work with me on the show right up. We're still doing some further projects, and we are also working with the British Council and the British Embassy in Yangon to connect with contemporary artists over the exhibition. So yes, it's been a huge collaborative endeavor, including lots of Burmese people, actually lots of other academics from around the world, and we're hoping to engage with contemporary artists as well. The book wasn't written just by me. There are various, I have written some of the chapters, but then Burmese academics have contributed to and have written other of the chapters. So yes, it's been I'm the face, but actually there's a huge number of people behind me. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So the next question is an anonymous one. they say, we visited Myanmar in December 2018, and it was the last river cruise of the particular holiday company we went with. And this company supplied food and books and things to schools and temples. So how do these institutions cope now without help from tourism? Do either of you feel like answering that?
Well, I can answer part of it, and then maybe Sandra will, or Sandra, do you want to start, please? Oh, I was just going to say, well, they're not coping right now. I mean, the country's effectively it's in a state of civil war, and schools are not functioning. There's been a huge civil disobedience movement, which means people have refused to work for the government, and that, of course, includes as teachers. So society is basically collapsing on many levels, but Sandra might have more specifics.
I probably don't need to add much more to what you've already said, Alexandra, apart from to say that those kind of impacts that you've highlighted they're countrywide, but they're also at the same time kind of variable in their manifestations and perhaps the degree of their manifestations in different parts of Myanmar. So but one of the things that's interesting, and some people have talked about as, if it's the right word to use, positive, possibly a positive about the very challenging current circumstances that the people of Myanmar find themselves in, is the way in which different groups within Myanmar have come together as part of the civil disobedience and resistance movement to current conditions.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Alex, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, I mean, the exhibition comes right up to the coup and beyond, and it looks at how artists are pushing back against that, and that it has involved much greater collaboration across ethnic lines, and that's demonstrated in the artworks that were projected onto the sides of buildings as a form of resistance in 2021.
Yeah, there's a great video projection at the end of the exhibition. As Alex says, it's very interesting with some contemporary art there. So we have a question from James McRae for Alex. Question: how do you address the Rohingya question in the exhibition?
We have worked with a Rohingya photographer who's currently living in one of the camps. There's obviously a big Rohingya community in the UK, and there are also obviously a number of charities that are working to help them. One of the things that has been done is they've set up a photographic competition in the camps to try and help people develop some skills. And of course, pictures are now easily shared and sold on the internet. And so in addition to these photographic competitions, you know, they're training people how to basically function as journalists. But one of the things we did was we chose an image that had won one of the photographic competitions, and we have included that in the show, and it's also in the book. One of the things I did not want to do, though, is simply to show the plight of the Rohingya people. It's a way of pigeonholing people that they become associated with, you know, the misery that they're going through. I didn't want to undermine that either. So we do talk about what has happened, but the image itself is not a picture of the camps. It's an absolutely gorgeous picture of a muddy watering hole. So by implication, it shows the conditions under which people live, but the image itself is aesthetically very beautiful. So thank you.
Okay. So an anonymous question: why has the country been renamed Myanmar, please?
Well, the renaming, so Burma and Myanmar are names that have been associated with the central Burman majority from nearly 1,000 years ago. So the two names are very long-standing. The British turned Burma into Burma. They anglicized it as Burma. And then when the country first became independent in 1948, it was the Union of Burma. This was changed to the Union of Myanmar by the military junta in 1989. And that continues to be the name, but initially depended on what side you approved of. If you approved of the junta, you called it Myanmar. And then if you didn't approve, you called it Burma. Now, of course, once the country opened up in 2010, 2011, 2012, then the situation became much more mixed. And both names were acceptable. And now, of course, I think nobody knows quite what to call it. So it's become a very complicated issue. But Burma and Myanmar are both feasible names. We've chosen to focus on using the official name Myanmar in the exhibition, though we do have we bracket the name Burma as well, so that people are aware that both refer to the same entity.
They're both still used.
Yes, they're both still used.
Okay. So Alessia Cottrell says, the extent of diversity within Myanmar is very interesting. Were there any religious tensions in early Myanmar? The coin suggests it was welcomed for political and economic reasons. So was the diversity also embraced socially within the people of Myanmar?
As I mentioned earlier, and maybe actually Sandra can talk about this a bit more, certainly, as I said, ethnicity was much more flexible. It was not a means of dividing society the way it is today. There were other ways of dividing society. So ethnicity really came to the fore in the course of the 19th century. And there's a very good book by Mandy Sedan called Being and Becoming Kachin, which talks about that process. In terms of religion, there have been Muslims in the country for a very long time, and kings employed them as mercenaries. They were also there as traders, and they were also there as gem merchants all over the country and in the different kingdoms as well. So I don't think there haven't been substantial studies as to the social impact, but there is a man named Henry Yule who visited the Myanmar in 1855. And he wrote that, many of these communities had integrated. He said you couldn't tell by sight who were the Muslims and who were the Buddhist Burmese, because everyone dressed the same and they effectively ate the same material, they ate the same food, obviously, except for pork. So that actually the communities were very, very integrated. But perhaps, Sandra, you might want to say something more.
Yes, and also, Sandra, actually, it goes into the next question, which you might like to take as well, which is from Kim Jones, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it appears that the national dress is an amalgamation of ethnic clothing styles of all the groups. I'm curious, how was this agreement reached among all the groups involved? A political miracle?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's probably for the Karenni themselves, and particularly those who were historically, and there are still people alive who were historically involved in those negotiations and processes earlier in the 20th century. It's probably for them rather than me to talk about the extent to which agreement was reached. I think the comment that I would make from an anthropological perspective is the word political that's used by the questioner is very apposite, because it was essentially a political development, and it was explicitly, the development of that dress was part of a political movement that was also a nationalist movement within that area of Myanmar. But the extent to which all of the ethnic groups involved and all of the members of those ethnic groups actually participated in and were in agreement with that kind of development is another question. And in Kaya state alone, there are other political directions and trajectories where the decision making might have been different or participated in to different degrees. I think so. It's complicated, basically, and was very much a kind of self-consciously political act, if that helps to address the question.
Okay, thanks. From Rose Kelly, for Sandra, before the British created the census, did the ethnic groups wear dress that identified their ethnicity? It sounded like they wore different dress depending on the circumstances.
It's a really interesting question, and I guess there's a number of different ways to respond to it. I mean, on one level, there's a lot more research that I think needs to be done into the clothing that was worn by different groups prior to the colonial period. Having said that, I wouldn't want it to sound like I was implying that before the colonial period, people did not have different kinds of dress amongst different groups or in different parts of the country, because they did, and they would have done, and there were different kinds of customary styles. What changed, and as I mentioned, this also links to comments that Alexandra was making too. What changed with the colonial period and the coming of the census and those kinds of kind of historical processes is that the association between what you wear on the one hand and who you are on the other becomes a much more conscious and essentialized and symbolic, I suppose, activity. So you move from from wearing something because that's the way it's done and that's what your mother and your grandmother wore, to it becoming a self-conscious donning of dress that says I am Karen or I am Kaya or whatever it might be.
Okay, thanks. The last question, I think, for Alex. Do you think that European colonialism is the key cause of the tensions between ethnicities, or are there other significant reasons?
Oh, I mean, no. I mean, there can't ever be a single cause of anything. There are many directions in which, you know, Myanmar could have gone after colonial times. I think what's the thing to think about in terms of, say, the census and the administrative systems that were developed by the British is that, you know, it set up certain realities that then, you know, contributed to, but I wouldn't, you know, I would never say that there's only one cause. Okay,
well, one more final question for Alex from Robin Smith. What and when was the kernel of the idea to put on this exhibition? And it's really interesting to know how long and how much effort goes into a show like this. Thank you all, I'll come and see it, he says. Thank you, Robin.
Great, thank you for coming. It takes a long time. So this exhibition has gone through various permutations. It was being talked about, I think, probably about in 2014. And then I finally put together a proposal in 2017, and then it went through various permutations, and then it was accepted in 2019. So it's been, you know, it's a long process. And actually, I probably could have done with another year of research and work before actually putting it on. So anyhow.
Yes, and to say in general, our exhibitions, we do program our exhibitions several years ahead. So at the moment we're programming for 2027. So the exhibition program right up till then is already filled. Well, so thank you to the speakers and thank you to all the people who've asked questions. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all for joining us. Just to say that the next event in this series about the Burma exhibition is actually going to be on the subject of ancient Myanmar. And that will be on the 14th of December at 5:30 to 6:30, the same time, GMT. So keep an eye on our website, because that will be, the booking for that will be open within a fortnight. And the exhibition, of course, Burma to Myanmar, is open until the 11th of February. So do come and see it if you can. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.